liebe Freundinnen und Freunde, liebe Besucher, es freut mich sehr, euch herzlich willkommen zu heißen bei unserer Veranstaltung Progressiver Journalismus als Akt des Widerstands in autoritären Zeiten. Es freut mich, dass trotz Pfingsten, trotz relativ schönem Wetter, doch einige heute hier zu uns gekommen sind. Das ist eine Veranstaltung des Büros der Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in Tel Aviv, des Kurt-Eisner-Vereins in Bayern, das ist sozusagen das bayerische Pendant zur Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, und von Medico international. Bevor ich an den Moderator des heutigen Abends übergebe, würde ich gerne meinen Dank aussprechen. Einmal an das FatCat, an die Betreiber der kulturellen Zwischennutzung hier, dass sie solche Veranstaltungen hier möglich machen. Das ist in dieser Stadt nicht selbstverständlich und deshalb vielen herzlichen Dank. Und ich möchte natürlich den Kolleginnen von +972 danken, dass sie diese Deutschland-Tour hier machen. Das ist der Auftakt. Sie werden auch noch in Berlin und in Hamburg sein. Es ist ja wirklich ein vermintes Gelände in einem Land, in dem die fast bedingungslose Israel-Solidarität als Teil der deutschen Staatsräson mittlerweile auch zu einem Werkzeug des Rechtsrutsches geworden ist. Es sind wirklich bittere Zeiten, in denen wir leben, gerade wenn man sich auch anschaut, was die israelische Armee derzeit nicht nur im Gaza, sondern auch und vor allem im Libanon verbricht. Während medial dazu vor allem auch rechte Narrative dominieren, reden wir gleichzeitig immer wieder auch über die Machtlosigkeit linker Medien in diesen heutigen Zeiten. Doch ich würde sagen, dass für die Macherinnen und Macher des +972 Magazin dies nicht gilt. Ihre Berichterstattung, nicht nur zum Genozid in Gaza, hat viele Menschen mitgenommen, überzeugt und auch aktiv werden lassen. Und ich glaube, das kann man in diesen Zeiten gar nicht hoch genug einschätzen. Ich will nur einmal eine persönliche Geschichte aus dem Nähkästchen erzählen. Ich habe am Institut für Kommunikationswissenschaft studiert und war dort auch schon politisch aktiv. Und da gibt es einen Professor, dem habe ich geschrieben, weil wir eigentlich die Veranstaltung bei Ihnen machen wollten. Das hat aus organisatorischen Gründen, nicht aus inhaltlichen Gründen dann nicht geklappt. Und ich habe gesagt, ja, vielleicht kennen Sie das Magazin +972. Und er antwortete auf meine E-Mail, indem er sagte, die Berichterstattung von +972 zu der KI-Tötungsmaschine Lavender war für ihn ein zentraler Breaking Point, um die ganze Sache anders zu sehen. Und das fand ich sehr beeindruckend, weil ich in meiner Studienzeit sehr heftige Diskussionen zu Israel-Palästina mit ihm hatte. Und das für ihn auch, er ist aufgrund dieser Berichterstattung auch aktiv geworden und hat eine viel beachtete Studie zum Vertrauensverlust in deutschen Leitmedien bezüglich ihrer Israel-Palästina-Berichterstattung erstellt. Sehr lesenswert, wenn Sie lesen wollt, fragt mich einfach. Ich hoffe, dass die heutige Veranstaltung noch für viele weitere zum Erweckungsmoment wird und deutlich macht, was Medien noch ausrichten können, wenn sie macht- und herrschaftskritisch sind. In diesem Sinne, ich freue mich sehr auf die heutige Veranstaltung. Ich will noch 3 Sachen kurz ankündigen. Einmal in den gleichen Räumlichkeiten wie hier im FatCat, nicht in diesem Saal, sondern im Karl-Orff-Saal, findet am 17. Juni das nächste, ich glaube mittlerweile 4. Make Freedom Ring-Konzert statt mit Michael Badenboim, dem palästinensischen Nasmir-Ensemble und auch einigen Sprecherinnen und Sprechern. Holt euch Tickets, die Einnahmen gehen auch an die Nothilfe für Gaza von Medico international. Die zweite Ankündigung, es gibt auch einen Stand, wo man die rassistische Bezahlkarte, der Geflüchtete in München und Bayern ausgesetzt sind, außer Kraft setzen kann, indem ihr Gutscheine kauft. Wenn ihr das System verstehen wollt, fragt die Marina, sie ist mit dem Stand da und nutzt die Gelegenheit, um euch Gutscheine zu kaufen und damit auch Geflüchteten zu helfen. Jetzt übergebe ich das Wort, und zwar, es freut mich hier auf der Bühne Gil, Dana, Ben und Alaa zu haben, und ich wünsche euch eine sehr erkenntnisreiche und spannende Veranstaltung. Dankeschön.
Ja, vielen Dank, lieber Kell, für die Einführung. Und jetzt werde ich ins Englische switchen. Noch kurz bevor ich das mache, wer Übersetzung braucht von Englisch ins Deutsche, kann sich dieses Headset hier nehmen. Das gibt es vorne am Eingang. Also jetzt ist noch eine Chance, das zu tun, bevor ich ins Englische switche. Und noch eine letzte organisatorische Bemerkung auch, wenn ihr oder sie Interesse habt an der Arbeit der Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung und auch des Israel-Büros der Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung und natürlich der Arbeit von Plus-972. Es hängen ziemlich großflächig und weiträumig QR-Codes aus, die ihr scannen könnt, um auf diese verschiedenen Seiten zu kommen. So, now switching to English so you can understand me too for the rest of the evening. Welcome to everyone, thank you for coming. My name is Bishochart, I'm the head of office of the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in Tel Aviv, and I'm very pleased to welcome Dana, Alaa, and Ben with me here tonight. I will introduce them a bit more in detail in the following minutes before we start the discussion. So as Kerem said regarding Germany, I think also globally, I think that when we discuss Israel-Palestine, not only in the last 2.5 years, also the decades before, it's oftentimes, and as we discussed this morning, it's about discussing narratives, and it's about which narrative is stronger in the media landscape. And the question is also for progressive media, which narratives can they push and how to do this. So the media landscape is one of the most challenged fields on which the battle for truth and accountability to the ongoing Israeli violence and aggressions in the region is being waged. So I think we're very glad to have representatives of this progressive Israeli-Palestinian magazine, Plus-972 to Germany this week, to discuss this topic, but of course also their work as a binational organization on the ground. So yes, Plus-972 magazine is, as Kerem said, one of the leading independent media platforms in Israel and Palestine, where Israeli and Palestinian journalists report together for an audience of millions in English. By doing so, they defy the growing authoritarianism and censorship that we see all over the world, and also, of course, in Israel and Palestine, and also stand for fair and accurate journalism. Their reporting and analyses have increasingly found their way into other English-speaking international outlets such as The Guardian, and also in German liberal media landscape, that their work is increasingly seen and valued. We will discuss tonight the major challenges and also the dangers that media professionals in Israel and Palestine face today more than ever before, and also what potential impact these restrictions have on critical reporting in Germany about the situation in Israel and Palestine. We'll do this with our guests to my left, Dr. Dana Mills. Dana is the Resource Development Manager of Plus-972 magazine. She has been active in Israeli-Palestinian civil society for the last years, following 15 years as an academic. She received her PhD from Oxford and in 2014, and is the prolific author of 5 books, including a biography of Rosa Luxemburg. Thanks for being with us, Dana. Second to my left is Alaa Salama, the audience engagement manager at Plus-972 magazine, among others. Alaa is an author and journalist born in Syria to Palestinian refugee family. He holds a master's degree in Israel studies from Birzeit-Universität, close to Ramallah. His research focuses on the history of Christian Zionism, very interesting topic, I have to say, and its influence on politics, culture, and literature. Thanks for being with us, Alaa. And last but not least, obviously, is Ben Reiff. Ben is deputy editor at Plus-972 magazine, where he's worked since 2021. He has written for publications including The Guardian, The Nation, The New Statesman, and Haaretz. He's a founding member of the editorial collective at Vashti Media, a left-leaning Jewish magazine in the UK. And after several years as an activist and journalist in Israel and Palestine, he's now based in London. Thanks for being with us, Ben. So we'll now start the discussion for approximately 45 minutes to an hour, the 4 of us, after then opening, of course, for your questions. I will start maybe with really like a brief history question, a short history lesson. So maybe Dana, can you start by telling us about how Plus-972, but also the sister medium Local Call, came to their current structure and ethos, and how far does the history go back, and how did it develop in the last years?
Thank you, Gil, and thank you everyone for being with us tonight. It means a lot to us, especially in such nice weather, and not to be taken for granted. So 972 was founded as a site of mostly, at that time, Israeli Jewish bloggers who, in 2010, felt that the media discourse in mainstream sources was too biased and too jaded and lent towards the Israeli influence discourse. And at the time, it was a kind of site that was kind of used by bloggers on the side of their day job, so it wasn't kind of a professional journalism site. Fairly quickly after its foundation, the site had become binational, and that has become a very central ethos and practice of the site since then. Binationalism is very central to what we do. We'll elaborate that also later, but something that we kind of hold very close to our hearts and practice in various ways. And since 2010, since the founding, also the site became professional in stages, and it became a place where journalists work, and both editorial teams, our media teams, such as Alaa and other people who work in dissemination of information, are all trained journalists of the highest standard. But the core mission is still there to challenge mainstream discourses around Israel-Palästina. In 2014, we founded the same organizations that founded 972, founded Local Call, which is co-published with Just Vision, an American media organization. And Local Call is a website that works independently but very closely with 972 and does something similar in Hebrew. So obviously the media landscape is different in Israeli Hebrew-speaking media to English-speaking media, but the two sites kind of have the same core mission. And since its founding, both sites, and especially 972, I'll talk mostly about 972 this evening, have developed, I would say, 3 strands of reporting that we kind of work along. The first, and maybe some of you have read, and in Kerem's introduction, I know he already mentioned our investigations, for instance, the one around lavender. And a lot of the work we've been doing over the past 3 years, but going way, way before. If you look at our site, you will see a continuation of things that we've been doing for years before the 7th of October. Our investigations of the use and abuse of various instruments, power, corporations in the Israeli military complex. After the 7th of October, and with the kind of unleashing of the genocide on Gaza, we looked specifically at the use of tech and big tech companies through Israeli military. We did investigations around Microsoft, Amazon, Google, basically any big company that you're using. We probably will have shown ties to Israeli intelligence and how that has been abused throughout the genocide. And I started by Microsoft because actually after publishing an investigation showing the ties between the Israeli intelligence unit 8200 and Microsoft, a huge wave of dissent within the company itself started and within its stakeholders. And after public pressure in the States and beyond it, Microsoft cut its ties with the Israeli military. So that's kind of a huge achievement for our investigation team. And for us as a collective. The second strand of reporting and of what we do is what we term broadly as voices from the ground. So oftentimes when Israel-Palestine is being reported, it's only from the prism of the Israeli side, and it's through the prism of those enacting violence on civilian population. We center the voices of those who are on the side of receiving violence, of those who experience day after day of various forms of ethnic cleansing, of displacement, starvation, kind of endless list of war crimes. In Gaza, obviously, we've had reporters in Gaza way before October 7th, but that had become central for obvious reasons after October 7th. In the West Bank, where ethnic cleansing has really kind of reached unprecedented levels, dozens of communities that have been displaced, again, definitely for the past 3 years, but obviously a lot before that also. And now increasingly in other places, such as Lebanon, which is not receiving enough attention in mainstream media and is kind of currently undergoing very sustained violence from the Israeli military. And again, back in broad daylight. So this is the second pillar of what we report. And the third pillar is what we term broadly voices of conscience. So we are an independent journalist website, and the first thing that we hold kind of as a standard we work towards is professionalism, accuracy, working to the facts. But we're also consistently challenging narratives around war and violence that are seen as kind of the only acceptable reality between the river and the sea. And we give platform to people who are trying to push towards different directions of living together, Jews and Palestinians, not opting for militarism, not opting for violence. And this is what we call voices of conscience. One such example is conscientious refusers. As you probably know, in Israel there's a draft, you have to enlist in the military. And there are not that many, but there are a few really impressive, interesting young people who at 18 decide to refuse the draft, many of whom will go into military prison, sometimes for 2 years. And we make the point of giving them a platform, of accompanying them throughout the trial, accompanying them throughout, often from prison, they often write to us, we publish their writing from prison. And also their statement of why they refuse, which again in such a militaristic society, it's really crucial to give a platform to the voices that are actually dissenting against that central ethos. So this is broadly what we do in terms of the coverage of our work, and these are things that have developed but often have been kind of accentuated by the past sort of 3 years that have been really intense in various ways, but especially around the genocide in Gaza. And looking ahead, there are certain things that we know that won't change. That's the commitment to professionalism, commitment to binationalism and to independence, and sustaining this kind of commitment away from militarism and war.
Thank you, Dana. Before we continue to how your work has changed also in the last 2.5 years since 7th of October, maybe could you give us a bit of a background on how many people actually work at Line 72 magazine, because I think you discussed so many ranges of work that you're dealing with and so many of the 3 pillars, and it's in this destructive reality, this is just so much to fathom, so much to report about, and I think for our audience it would be interesting to hear how many people actually work on this and what this means for your editorial practice.
So we're a very small team by any standard. We're just over 20 people, all in all, including, we now have 2 podcasters, one in Hebrew, one in English. We have 2 social media managers who, in my humble opinion, do like the most important role of actually making sure that people read the stuff we write. We have various correspondents. As I said, we have voices on the ground, but we now have payroll correspondents in certain areas where we know it's important to keep a person who will have their eyes on quickly unfolding reality, and 2 full editorial teams in Hebrew and in English, and obviously like the back office staff such as myself, fundraising and managerial work around. It's a tiny team. We kind of all do everything at the same time. All of us also write in different phases for the magazine. We can contribute editorial feedback when necessary and when we wish to, not always when necessary. Maybe my editor friend will disagree. It really is a collective. I think that's one thing that has remained from its founding days. Like, we work closely together, we are a small collective. And I should say that binationalism is kind of core and is important also to this perspective, because in many organizations you will see that they are termed as coexistence or binational or whatever, and you will see the Israeli Jews who are holding the more kind of authoritative positions, and the Palestinians are sent to do the groundwork. And for us, that's really important to counter that and to have people giving feedback on all levels of management and of editing processes from different perspectives. And I have to say, for myself, it's very educational. I've been active on the left since I was 16, and I feel that working closely with colleagues who have a very different perception of reality just because they live in a very different reality to the one I'm living in constantly challenges me and my point of view. So I think it's something that we constantly rework with each other and sort of give each other kind of different points of view on kind of the same things that we look at. So yes, our day-to-day is very hectic because we're all doing everything at the same time. And it's a very fast changing reality, as I said. We don't do breaking news, so we kind of report things as they evolve, but still the speed of how news happens in Israel-Palestine is kind of breathtaking. So it's a very busy team, and it's a very energetic team, and very close-knit.
And I mean, obviously, looking at your website, the pace at which you really publish articles, and as you said, it's really not only the editorial team. I've seen some articles by you also co-authored in the last months. It really reflects exactly the spirit you're talking about, and also the binational co-resistance ethos. I would like to follow up with a question to you, Alaa. There are people who, in this mode of journalism, see more sort of an activism than actually accurate journalism. We were discussing this also this morning in the closed meeting we had. So how would you describe this relationship between the activist ethos, or the values you stand for, and the element of journalistic objectivity, neutrality, as people want to call it?
I think many media outlets sort of hide behind the motto of neutrality. But as we always discuss, neutrality is in fact a myth. Every time an editor works, every time a reporter writes, every time someone writes an opinion piece, they're making a decision. And that decision is not neutral. Who your sources are, where you send your reporters, who works on what, how you edit, what terms you use is never neutral. And so we're very clear in our journalistic standards, but we're also very clear in our mission, as we're not a media organization in Germany. We're a media organization in a place where nothing is normal. So we're very clear on that mission, and we're very clear on our values, which to some people would make us activists as well. We don't see that as going against our journalistic work. If standing by certain morals and certain values makes us activists, then that's that. But the truth is, you have to take a stand sometimes, and that's what we do.
Speaking of taking a stand, I think we all agree that the events of 7th of October, and of course what followed since the genocidal events in the 2.5 years since, in the Gaza Strip, the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, which is ongoing, of course the attacks now on southern Lebanon, and the entire regional situation have not been maybe the start of the conflict, obviously, but they've been a rupture. They've been a rupture in context. But how exactly did this context, and this question for you, Ben, how exactly did this context of 7th of October and what happened since impact your work, change your work, maybe speaking also of the values Alaa was referring to, how much more pressure did it make to stand by these values, or how much did it also make it sometimes difficult to stand by the values with all the pressure and developments going on around you?
Yeah, I mean, obviously as a media outlet based inside Israel, as an Israeli-Palestinian team, the events of 7th of October and everything that followed were like a total rupture in the reality that we exist in and that we work in, but also I think it's important to say like a continuation, but an acceleration of dynamics that already existed, right? I think what happened as a team on 7th of October is that we understood three things right away, and this has shaped our work ever since. The first is that the Hamas-led attack on that day was a horrific crime against civilians, and we do what we do out of our commitment to ending oppression, ending harm against civilians. Most of the time that means our work is focused on Palestinian civilians. This time it meant we were really focusing on Israeli civilians in that moment, and that was very clear to everyone. We have consistent values that are kind of really universal. The second thing is that it was immediately clear to us, in a way that I think a lot of the international media coverage left out, that there was a context to this, right? This didn't come out of nowhere. There is 100 years of history leading up to this point. History didn't start on 7th of October. Yes, this is an event that warrants coverage in a dramatic way, but this didn't come out of nowhere, so I think it was very important to us right away to insist on the context that led us to this moment. That's a context of decades of occupation, of apartheid, of settler colonialism, and we made that clear in our work from the very beginning. The third thing that was clear to us was that Israel's response to 7th of October on the population of Gaza would be colossal and horrific, and on a scale that none of us had ever witnessed before. And so this kind of informed how we kind of saw our role from that moment on. So the first thing that we did was to build a team of reporters, freelance reporters inside Gaza. So within about a week after the 7th of October, we had a team of about 5 or 6 freelance reporters inside Gaza who were desperate to kind of cover for an international audience what was unfolding in front of them and around them. One or two of these, I think 2 of these reporters had written for us before. They were, past contributors to 972, and we were in touch with them already, and we, had got on the phone with them and said, do you want to write for us? Our editor-in-chief, who I don't think it was mentioned, is a Palestinian from Haifa called Haaretz, who did amazing work, I think, especially in those first hours and days in this total blur of chaos in putting together this team of reporters. And through those 2, we connected with other reporters who had written for other outlets, or who were known to them as people who could help shape our coverage going forward. And so I think for the first weeks, months, and even to this day, this is a huge, huge focus of our work. It already was. I think, 972 was founded in large part in response to the Israeli incursion on Gaza in 2008, 2009. The local call in 2014 was founded largely in response to Israel's incursion on Gaza then, which was the deadliest until what's followed since 7th of October. And that has really been a focus of our work, largely in the sense that, I think for a lot of the international media coverage on Gaza in the last 2.5 years, it's been shaped by conversations in editorial rooms in Berlin, in London, in New York, wherever it may be. Our conversations about how to cover Gaza were shaped in Gaza, right? We have this team of reporters who are telling us what the story is, where they need to be, what's happening around them. And I think what we knew we needed to do in that moment was to give them the platform to tell that story. And I think, it's important to us to make clear that we think Palestinians are, reliable narrators of their own oppression in a way that I think for too long the international media has pretended that that's not the case. Alongside this, Gaza has been the core of our work, but simultaneously we knew that we needed to keep a focus elsewhere. That includes the West Bank, where, as Dan mentioned, settler militias have been carrying out pogroms on a near daily basis throughout the West Bank, trying to expel Palestinian communities from their homes. I think we're into around 60 or 70 individual whole Palestinian communities in the West Bank have been forcibly displaced since 7th of October. Again, that was a process that started long before 7th of October, but the acceleration has been really extreme, and we've made it our mission to cover that and to tell that story. Likewise, inside Israel's green line, inside the internationally recognized borders, there was an immediate crackdown on the freedom of speech of Palestinian citizens of Israel. People who posted on Facebook or other social media platforms against the war, against Israel's bombardment of Gaza, in solidarity with even family members in Gaza who were under attack, found themselves, arrested, wound up in an Israeli prison cell, simply for expressing opposition to the war. This was kind of, random everyday people, and also very prominent cultural figures who were kind of made an example of by the Israeli authorities in order to deter protests, particularly. And as well as that, I think we particularly in the first few weeks of the war, we published an awful lot of kind of expressions of dissent, as Dan said, by Israeli Jews who, we wanted to make clear that there was an alternative voice, that not all Israelis supported this. The vast majority of Israelis sadly supported this, but there was an alternative. There were people who were saying this is not the way, there is another future here that relies on all of us. And so we published as many of those voices as we could. Sadly, didn't make so much difference, but we continue to do that. I think it's, we still see value in doing that. And likewise, our investigations have really taken off. Similarly, this was a part of our work, but not as big a part of our work before October 7th. I think if people here know of 972 magazine, it's probably because of our investigations, particularly around the use of AI by the Israeli military to generate bombing targets in Gaza. So we reported on a tool called Lavender, which gave every Palestinian in Gaza a score from 1 to 100 based on how likely it was that they were a militant in Hamas. And the army then used that data to bomb people, including with their whole families in their homes, without checking how the AI system had made that decision. It was based on things as random as, if someone changes their phone number very often, maybe that makes it more likely that they're a Hamas militant. If someone is seen in the same place or frequents the same restaurants as known Hamas militants, then maybe they're a Hamas militant. The only check on kind of the only verification that was performed by a lot of intelligence officers in the Israeli army before they authorized these strikes was a kind of 20-second check listening into a phone call that person was making to make sure they were male, not female. And if they're male, okay, they must be a Hamas militant, let's bomb them with their family, sometimes with all of their neighbors. And I think, a lot of this picked up coverage around the world. It was used in South Africa's application to the International Court of Justice, accusing Israel of genocide, which is still ongoing. I think they've been referenced in ICC reports as well, and UN reports into genocide in Gaza. So I think we've really tried to shape the way that the world understands the war, and yeah, we continue to do that. It's tough to wake up every day for the last 2.5 years and see such a miserable situation on the ground that is only getting worse. But I think it's important to us nonetheless to keep doing this work. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks for this extensive overview of your work in these times. I would like to follow up on the question of actually doing journalistic work in Gaza and what this means basically for the journalists you work with. Also for journalists in the West Bank, you mentioned it. Also recently a regular contributor, an activist, Alaa Salama in the West Bank was killed by an Israeli settler, murdered by an Israeli settler. So basically all the people who work for you, obviously, but of course all people in Gaza and also most people in the West Bank do these things under immense security situation, basically, and Israel has also recently been ranked on 116th place in the annual Press Freedom Index of Reporters Without Borders, also become infamous for as independent investigations revealed, deliberate targeting of Palestinian and also Lebanese journalists. So what does these conditions mean? And maybe Alaa, this question is for you first, but of course feel free to weigh in, Dana and Ben, for how you work with the journalists on the ground. What does it mean for the journalistic practice to be voices on the ground in a situation where the Israeli army still restricts the entry of mainly foreign journalists to the Gaza Strip, be it only with so-called embedded entry. So what does it mean for Palestinian journalists on the ground in the West Bank and Gaza when they work for you or do journalistic work in general?
Yeah, like everything else in Israel-Palestine, it's not an equal situation in any way possible. While we're always asked if our journalists face a dangerous situation or face pressure, and the answer varies wildly between those in the West Bank, those in Tel Aviv, and then those in Gaza. Obviously, Israel has killed over 200 journalists in Gaza and over 75,000 people there. So clearly the situation there is dire, but particularly for journalists. Our journalists in Gaza have survived their houses being bombed. They've all lost family members. They've written to us from underneath the bombs. They've written to us while trying to escape from one place to another. And the work they did is just incredible, and it just gave us the power to keep going, to have someone write for your magazine while they're trying to seek shelter for themselves and their families is incredible. And every single one of them has been affected massively. But that's just the fact of being Palestinian in Gaza. And the same thing goes for our journalists in the West Bank, where again they're targeted first and foremost for being Palestinian, and not necessarily for being journalists. One example is our West Bank reporter, who's also the co-director of No Other Land, who basically has his house raided almost like every few months. So that's the kind of pressure that he has to live with, that we can report on, but like we can't even begin to imagine it. And not to mention that Bassel and his whole community, they live in Masafri, where their area is under constant threat from the Israeli army, but also from settlers. So these are journalists who are, yes, working as journalists to expose what's happening to the world, but they're also defending themselves and defending their families and defending their homes on a daily basis. So the situation varies by a lot, and I think that what Ben said about considering Palestinian journalists a trustworthy source is one of our core values, and it's something that we must insist that international media does as well. It's incredible to see. I mean, clearly Israel barred every journalist from the world from going into Gaza, and again, it's still 200 journalists in there, and Palestinians in Gaza have had to do the work and tell the world about what's happening, and without them, we wouldn't know half of what happened, and many of them are not even professional journalists. And yet we see much of the international media either treat them as untrustworthy sources or just ignoring them completely. We've also seen in the past few months, Israel has organized these trips, basically, where they take in international journalists with the army into Gaza, and I think that's a slap in the face of every Palestinian journalist, for journalists to go in with the army that's committing genocide to, I don't know, look at what's happening as if that's going to reveal any truth.
May I weigh in this question? So if you were to give a recommendation to, let's say, a foreign Israel-based journalist who wants to get into Gaza, maybe all three of you, whoever wants to answer, which maybe in their perspective would be the only thing they could do in order to see what's going on, at least see a bit of it, would you advise, and would you say, don't do this because it's complicity with the army that committed genocide?
Absolutely, because you're not going to get any part of the truth that you cannot get from journalists who are already inside of Gaza. If you're going in an army tank, then that's the perspective you're going to see, and there's just absolutely nothing to gain from it but giving legitimacy to the army that's doing that.
Can I just add as well, our colleague Amos Gleason, who's in Berlin, wrote a brilliant piece for our website a few months ago after the latest attempt by the Foreign Press Association to challenge the Israeli military and the Israeli government's refusal to allow foreign journalists into Gaza. And they've been, engaged in a court case for basically 2.5 years, which has borne absolutely no fruit. Israel still is resolutely, refusing to allow journalists into Gaza except in these military escorts. And what Amos said in this article was, okay, we've tried the legal route. As Alaa said, I think it's foolish for foreign journalists to go into Gaza with the Israeli military and to think that they're getting the real story. What I think international journalists need to do is to kind of cease any cooperation with the Israeli government, with the Israeli military. Amos makes this case strongly in his piece. Not to give interviews to Israeli spokespeople, not to quote them in your articles, not to offer that perspective at all. So long as Israel refuses to allow foreign journalists into Gaza, I think we've reached this point where, 2.5 years into a genocide, what are we doing? I think we need to escalate that strategy severely.
Speaking of maybe censorship, self-censorship, I wanted to ask you, Dana, about how censorship works in the Israeli media landscape. I've recently read a very intriguing piece by a contributor, Sebastian Ben Daniel, and I'll quote just one of the paragraphs about the role of, let's say, the so-called liberal journalism in Israel when it comes to the crimes committed against Palestinians. So I'm quoting, mainstream Israeli media, not the openly propagandistic outlets like Channel 14, but the institutional press has become one of the clearest examples in any so-called democracy of wartime information management fused with the active manufacturing of public consent. This has not merely been a matter of ignoring what happens in Gaza, which, though unacceptable, would at least lend ordinary Israelis plausible deniability. The coverage has in fact been relentless, but it's not coverage of reality. So, Dana, how do you relate to this? And how did you experience this in your last 2.5 years in Tel Aviv?
So, the depressing thing about Israeli media, which is a complete mirror image to what has been discussed here, both in terms of Palestinian media on the ground and international media to an extent, is that a lot of the censorship happening within Israeli media is completely volitional and even, I would say, kind of encouragement of mechanisms that allow for censorship. I'll explain. After October 7th, there was complete alignment of this mainstream media narratives with very few dissenting voices, with the mainstream militaristic and political narrative. Some of what we saw, in addition to the kind of reality that Ben described of military tours taking international correspondents into Gaza, was Israeli journalists volitionally, out of their own will, joining military operations in Gaza and then in Lebanon, sometimes within military uniform. So imagine what it means for your coverage if you are joining as a soldier committing those war crimes, and what it means for the people you're supposed to cover, if that's the kind of image that you're projecting. And a lot of what we've been seeing within Israeli mainstream media is just complete adherence to the militaristic narrative, no dissent, no even attempt to unpack. I have to say, and I really sort of to take on from what Alaa said, which I really feel in day-to-day work we do in the collective, within the website, as an Israeli living in Tel Aviv, there's very little sanctions or stakes for dissenting at the moment. So, I was just at an international media festival in Perugia, and we heard, for instance, from colleagues in Russia, the reality they face is very different. Actually, to be a dissenting voice in Israeli society, especially around apartheid and genocide, doesn't carry a lot of sanctions. And yet the complete kind of alignment of mainstream narratives towards the government official narrative is really, really sad and depressing. I will say, so some of you will have heard, and there are kind of crackdowns on media freedom, and as Gil said, media fares very badly in these kind of rankings. A lot of those attacks on media are around issues of corruption, are around issues of the rule of law, for the simple reason that the liberal mainstream Israeli Jewish audience cares about that much more than about war crimes or genocide. So, for instance, Haaretz, which is the biggest liberal newspaper, often covers things around Netanyahu's trials, often covers kind of crackdown on rule of law, and is then subject to more attacks than, for instance, we would be subject to, just because the things that we cover don't interest most of the Israeli Jewish public, which I think is depressing in its own right. You kind of imagine what rallies people up and what makes the media outlets kind of take it and want to create this confrontation, which I think kind of puts more responsibility both on us but also on international media to challenge that, because we're not even dealing with a situation in which people are afraid to voice dissent. We're dealing with a situation in which people do have access to a lot of information, but are sort of very willingly taking on a narrative that is given to them and not trying to tease anything beyond what they're being given through mainstream media. And I think what we've seen over the past 2.5 years, definitely, but even before that, was that the role of pushing the Israeli Jewish public outside of its comfort zone, sort of saying, why are you going along with this? And I have to say, I've been in Tel Aviv throughout these entire years, and whereas our daily life was nowhere near our colleagues in the West Bank, and definitely not like Gaza, but all the regional wars that Israel has started, kind of both Iran wars and then various attacks that we suddenly heard of in the region did have implications for people's everyday lives. So we did run back and forth to the bomb shelter quite often. And you kind of think, if this isn't making you question the kind of militaristic society in which we live, what will? And I think the answer is only more international pressure and only more kind of international questioning of the narratives in which we live. So the mirror image of like having a very violent, very racist society that enables kind of crackdowns and just raids randomly journalists' houses, kills journalists without any accountability, is a collective citizenship body that doesn't ask any questions. So I think our role within the international civil society is to ask how to push that citizenship body beyond its comfort zones.
And you do this obviously by having also the Hebrew language outlet, which is not the focus today, but of course a very interesting example for how it can be tried, but obviously isn't successful as it should be in these times. I would like to go back to a formal element of censorship, namely the military censorship. Ben, you as an editor have been accompanying the investigative pieces of 972, mainly by Yuval Abraham, on the use of AI, for example, in Gaza in the last years. So for those who don't know, maybe you can expand on this a bit. Israel is a country where there is active military censorship for all articles related to security issues, so-called security issues from the Israeli perspective. They have to go to a censor. And Ben, you've been basically in this process, and nevertheless, these pieces were published, but they went a long process. Maybe you can give us a bit of an example, a bit of an insight into this process and what this means for your editorial work, and also when the point comes where you have to say, we can't publish this because the censorship is maybe too strong, or when does it make sense?
Yeah, so 972 didn't always submit articles to the Israeli military censor, but in, I think, 2015 or 16, the chief censor, which is an official role in the military, wrote a letter to 972's editors at the time, basically threatening them with the full force of the law if they didn't comply with the censor. Ever since, we have been forced to comply. So what that means is basically any article that relates to, as Gil said, kind of national security broadly defined, but particularly articles that reveal new information about anything to do with Israel's military or security kind of systems or decisions or technology, must be submitted prior to publication to the Israeli military censor. The censor can kind of request or demand redactions. These can be small, these can be large. The censor can kill an entire piece from going to print or going to publication. And it can also retroactively interfere in a piece that hasn't been prior submitted to the censor. You're also forbidden by law from revealing the censor's interference in an article. So where it interfered, how much it interfered, if it interfered at all, we're forbidden from revealing to our audience. This is obviously like a huge kind of violation of the freedom of the press. Israel is the only self-professed democracy, and obviously it's clear from everything we've said that Israel is not a democracy, but the only self-professed democracy that operates a censorship system as severe as this. And so what that looks like for us when we're writing our investigations is that we might have hugely revelatory information that we can never make public to our audience. We do our best. We sometimes go back and forth with the censor. Sometimes it's certain words they don't want. Sometimes it's certain facts. Sometimes it does mean that they eliminate so much information from an article that we believe it's no longer of value to publish. which is hugely regrettable, right, in terms of making information public as a public, interest. I think, I'm thinking what else to say about the censor. I mean, ultimately, I think almost always we decide to publish, because I think largely it's better to have some information out in the open than no information. The other things we do, I think maybe we can say there's two things that we do to kind of push back against the censor's interference. The first one is that our executive director, Chagai Matar, who's also a founder of Local Call, every year submits a Freedom of Information request to the Israeli military censor, requesting information on the extent of the censor's interference in the Israeli media over the past year. So every year we publish an article saying the Israeli censor interfered in this many articles this year, this many redactions, this many articles were killed entirely. I think that's something we see as hugely being in the public interest, and there's no other outlet in Israel that does that. The second thing we do, and this is, it's not why we do it, but we have now a really strong relationship with The Guardian in the UK and also its US branch. And often our investigations in the last couple of years have been co-published with The Guardian. The Guardian is not subject to censorship in the same way that we are, which means that sometimes there's information that we would like to make public which we can't. The Guardian can make it public. We are then permitted by law to report on The Guardian's information that they've published, right? So it's ridiculous. But once the information is out in public, it happened, I saw it today with a case, there was a small American outlet published an article about revealing the target of an Iranian missile strike in central Tel Aviv at the beginning of the war, this recent war, which was never made public in Israel because of the military censorship. As soon as that was published in this American outlet, suddenly the entire Israeli media rushes to publish that information. So I think it's absurd, like how this all functions. But frankly, we can be, us as editors or the writers or the heads of media outlets can be fined, can be threatened with having our publication shut down, can ultimately be threatened with prison time if we don't comply with this. Which, I think says a lot about Israel's willingness to kind of have itself exposed to the full extent of what it's doing.
So basically this military censorship, as I would see this as part of a larger scale, it's an attempt to manufacture the flow of information to the Israeli public, but also on international level. The concept's called hasbara. So it's basically the attempt, the heavily funded attempt, I think this year, the hasbara budget for basically influencing reporting and discourse in Israel-Palestine by the public ministry of, I think, diaspora affairs, if I'm not mistaken, is like between 600 and 700 million US dollars that they invest in influencers, for example. And also stating that your model of, and this is a question to all of you, so maybe you could think who would answer first, that your model of binationalism is a model of co-resistance. Would you also consider your work sort of a counter-hasbara to basically the ways of influence that and the narratives that are trying to be shaped by the Israeli public opinion influencers, the state, but of course also aligned media?
It's an interesting framing. I think I would see our work as hasbara for human rights, international law, and the rule of law in a world in which these concepts are losing meaning. And I feel that, as I said, I live in Tel Aviv, I live within Israel, and it's kind of living in a constant mirror world in which you're constantly bombarded with information that gives you a certain narrative that makes you feel that the world in its entirety is against you, everyone is out to kill you all the time, and unless your country will start random regional wars with countries you hadn't thought about before, Iran being a prime example, you will be unsafe. And equally, every critique of anything that your country does is first and foremost anti-Semitism. I think it's important to raise this, especially here, where I know the discourse around this is especially volatile and especially hard to actually hold Israel accountable and to call for the end of impunity that Israel is enjoying internationally. And I think the work that we do, first of all, by giving platform to binational journalism, and by, as Ben said earlier, by talking about the need to stop human costs and to actually stop endangering lives, all lives, between the river and the sea by this violent militaristic regime, is something that I feel also is an Israeli Jew protects me. So I feel that, you know, this kind of very often the kind of pro-Israel, pro-Palestine narratives. I think that what we do is, as I said, pro-human rights, and is really lacking in both media and general kind of discourse narratives. It's really hard to counter Hasbara. Like, it's such a huge machine. It's funded in a way that we can never be funded. It's kind of really gets into very deep elements of all kind of life, both within Israel and outside of it. But I think once you kind of look from outside, it really is Alice in Wonderland. Like, you leave that world and they're like, you can never enter again. And I think it's our role to unpick it and to sort of hold Israel accountable for things that no one else is really pushing it on. I think it's really important, something that we also do. So obviously our focus is first and foremost on the ground and on those people who live between the river and the sea. But we also look a lot at the weaponizing of anti-Semitism and how that is used to silence debate internationally. And obviously this is something that we've always been engaged in, but especially over the last 3 years has become really volatile and has become a mechanism of oppression, of dissent, both around obviously Israel and Palestine, but generally I feel that, you know, just the fear of saying anything that might be perceived as critical of Israel has really been abused by so many governments, including the government of the country in which we're sitting, just to silence dissent more broadly and to sort of embolden racism and embolden sexism, embolden anti-queer sentiment, and like just generally to kind of become another mechanism for the rise of authoritarianism internationally. So we see that as part of our mission and part of the thing that we kind of center in our reporting. So whereas again, if you go on our website, and I encourage you to go on it often and to see what we're publishing, you will see a lot of reporting from the ground, but you'll also see reporting from the ground from demonstrations around the world. We've reported what has been happening in the UK around Palestine Action. We've been reporting what's happening here, because we see that as completely part of the same world of what we're reporting in Masafayata, in Gaza. These are the mechanisms that enable those war crimes to go unteased. So these are kind of two faces of what we do.
Maybe following up on the element of how to counter Hezbollah, Alaa, you're responsible for the audience engagement, for social media work. And I guess you have also, I'm sure you have insights into how the readership development is at the site. So what can you tell us about, you know, the ways you operate on social media to try to reach a larger audience? How has the audience broadened in the last years? And what are your aims maybe for the next years when it comes to disseminate your work? Also in Germany, obviously, but also worldwide.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interest in the work that we do, and it's inherent in the core structure of Plus 972 magazine, because I think a lot of people worldwide are hungry for the kind of journalism that we do. And the kind of model that we present that may appear as impossible, this model of co-resistance. They clearly want to disseminate the idea that this is eternal, and we're proof that it's not. So there's already this hunger for this kind of news, for this kind of coverage, I'm sorry. And we've seen our readership soar in the past few years because we were presenting the world with something that they weren't seeing at the time. I mean, we've discussed this often, that now a lot of independent media is echoing many of the things that we have been saying for a decade now. We feel that there's a shift in the narrative, and there's a shift in what media outlets feel like they can say and do, and a lot of that, obviously we're not the only ones, but a lot of that was influenced by what we do. And we see this great interest in the number of readers that we get, and the numbers of readers that we get from the United States, and from Europe, and from Germany, where which is like our third largest audience, despite the fact that the website is in English. And we do our best to reach as many people as possible, but again, I think unfortunately we live in the age of disinformation, and it's a lie that takes 2 seconds to come up with and to disseminate takes forever, takes many, many hours to fact check. Many hours for people to go after it and to write, and for editors to work, and for us to try and publish. So we're constantly fighting with misinformation. And in the case of Israel, this is misinformation that's being funded by a government. So like Dana said, this is funding that we could never dream of. But again, we're seeing all over the world this movement that is starting to see and starting to dissent, because our work is the truth, basically, and people want to see that, and they're hungry for it. So we're doing our best, but so much is against this work, unfortunately, including the very platforms that we try to use. We all know about the censorship that we see on social media. It's been proven and reported on that Meta, for example, heavily suppresses any kind of content that is pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel in any way, and we see that. We see that most of our followers on these platforms don't even get to see what we publish. We know that X, for example, especially after Elon Musk took over it does its best not to let people off of the platform, and so media outlets like us, we have to struggle to get any kind of readership from that platform. And so there's all these algorithms that do their work, and we don't even understand how they work, but there's also like an active role by these platforms and these companies to try and discourage certain information from reaching the wider public. And part of our response to that has been what we're calling "let's ditch the algorithm." So we're now asking people to, instead of simply letting the algorithms of Facebook and Instagram and X determine what they see, to actually seek out information, including +972, and connect with us in direct ways, such as the newsletter, where there is no algorithm and no one is going to stop us from speaking directly to you, which I encourage all of you to go ahead and visit the website and sign up for the newsletter, because it's the only avenue that we and you control without third parties being involved.
So we're running out of time. We're almost reaching an hour of discussion. So I would like to pose my last question to all three of you. It's kind of a connected question, because I think it's important nevertheless when we talk about your binational working model, your working model of co-resistance. We talked about the algorithms, we talked about Hasbara as forces that obviously are opposed to this form of work. But there are also voices which are not dominant, but there are also on the radical left, one would say, that see in your sort of collaboration, co-resistance work, also some sort of normalization, one would say, of Israeli existence or Israeli-Palestinian co-resistance. So maybe connecting to this question, what would you say, what keeps you going in this reality, despite obviously the obstacles you face from far-right, mainstream media outlets, from governments, but also with criticism within the camp that you see yourself belonging to. So maybe to all three of you, and then we would open for the crowd.
Yeah, I think in the initial days, weeks, months after October 7th, certainly I felt like I was waking up every day with the mission being to stop the war. I think that was very clear to us in our work, that we need to do everything we can do that's possible to stop this insanity, to stop this slaughter. Time went on, we realized that the impact that we wanted to have in that regard was not gonna happen. The odds were stacked against us. And I think as time's gone on, it's definitely become easier to despair in so many ways, and we all do that, I think. And we have to balance that despair with our motivation to keep going. I think for me at least, I'm curious what you guys think, like, I see our work these days, not as an attempt to stop a war that we know we can't stop, a genocide that we know we can't stop. But I think we play a really important role, both in showing the world what's really going on, and so that people know what's still happening inside Gaza. And I know a lot of you might have noticed that there's much less coverage out of Gaza now, and I think, as we said, that's largely because Israel killed so many journalists. I think it's killed 1 in 10 journalists in Gaza. That was a stat from a year ago. It's more than that now. And I think the other main value in what we do now is documenting for the historical record, right? As I said, our reports have been used at the ICC and the ICJ in order to try to bring accountability against Israel and justice for Palestinians. This will continue to be the case. These accountability processes are going to go on for many, many years. We may not see the fruits of that work, in the foreseeable future. We may not see the fruits of that work in our lifetime, but I think there's still real value to making what we're seeing with our own eyes, visible for more people and visible for future generations, so that this will never be forgotten, and so that accountability processes really can be pushed forward, both now and into the future.
I think what keeps me going, and what I know keeps a lot of us going, is that simply we don't have the luxury of not working on this, because the victims don't have the luxury of ignoring this, and we don't have the luxury of stopping what we do. And I do think that there's great impact to be had, and I do think that great impact has been achieved in many ways. Yes, we all wanted to stop the war, and maybe that was naive, but I think what we did, and not just us, obviously, us and many media outlets and many NGOs and many organizations, is that we are bearing witness, and we are making sure that the world knows what's happening. And I think, I'm not optimistic, but I think that Israel had to stop at a certain point, and there are certain red lines that Israel could not cross, and that was because of international pressure that came from media, but also came from the streets, from the millions who demonstrated in every city in the world. I think Israel had to stop. Israel's not, it's not God. It can't do whatever it wants. It can't go on forever. It cannot cross every red line. And even though it doesn't feel like it, even though countless lives have been lost, I think what we did as a collective, what we did as humanity everywhere, including here in Germany, is that we stopped it at a certain line. Obviously, so much more could have been done, but it had to stop. And I think what we did was part of that.
So, from my perspective, a lot of things that have been said, but I see myself as an Israeli speaking from the wrong side of history, which might resonate in a certain way in this room. And I think a lot about what Ben said about our responsibility in archiving, and especially, as you mentioned, we work very closely together with a Hebrew site that insisted to translate all our reporting from Gaza to the Israeli public that didn't want to read. And it's a very kind of strange thing to do, to sit and translate something that you know maybe dozens of people will go and read. And just to give you some of the headlines of the things we've been working on, bodies rotting in the street because there's no place to bury them, children who died before the age of 1. These are kind of the stories that we've been publishing over the past few years. And we've been talking about it internally, about our responsibility towards the future, to be like, we knew. We always knew. And yet, there was refusal to act. So we see that as a responsibility. And the other thing that keeps us going, which is not easy to see, is our responsibility to each other. And we are a collective, we are friends, we check on each other. And when some of our reporters' houses are raided, we sit on the WhatsApp group and check by the hour what's happening. And when we were rushing through the bomb shelters in Tel Aviv, which is obviously hugely privileged because the vast majority of people living between the river and the sea don't have access to bomb shelters. When I came back, I saw like countless WhatsApp messages from my friends at the team being like, "Are you okay?" And like, if you can't do that, I'll do that for you. So yeah, as I said, we don't have the privilege to give up.
Thank you very much, Dana, of course, all three of you for this, I think, emotional discussion, very insightful discussion. I think we touched upon a lot of subjects, could have talked about a lot more, and many more questions on my pad. But I would like to take the opportunity to also open the floor now to the audience. There will be a microphone going around by my colleague Jan, if I'm not mistaken. Thanks so much, Jan. So maybe we gather 2 or 3 questions from the audience. Please limit yourself for time reasons to 2 questions, so that as many people as possible can pose the questions. We'll have 20 to 30 minutes for this round. So Jan will have the microphone, which is here. Thanks. And feel free to start the round. I will have a quoted, if possible, list of questions.
Is it possible for you to cover in any ways the issue of torture and abuse in Israeli prison? Und eine Frage an unseren Moderator. Wie frei kann das Büro der Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in Israel überhaupt arbeiten? Danke.
Seeing the censorship and the repression you were facing from the very beginning, I always wondered how it was possible that you could report about the Hannibal Directive, and what was the reaction of the Israeli public when you published that?
I have a question regarding numbers. So could you tell us something about outreach? How many, for example, I'm very interested in how many people read the Lavender piece. So I know this is sometimes a secret for news outlets, but is it in the 10,000s or 100,000? Because for me and for the German audience, or for a certain part of the German audience, it had a huge impact, and I'm just interested in that.
Should to answer this first round, so maybe start with a question about torture in Israeli prisons and how far it was possible to report on that.
Yeah, so we've done a lot of reporting on torture and abuse inside Israeli prisons. I think we were one of the first outlets actually to report on sexual abuse at Statesman. We published an interview with a Palestinian lawyer who had visited a detainee. It was one of the first times that a lawyer was allowed to visit Statesman and to speak to a detainee there. And he revealed, rampant all kinds of abuse, including sexual abuse, which obviously has made headlines around the world long after that. I think it was as early as November or December 2023, we published an investigation by our investigative reporter Yuval Abraham, who had interviewed, again, he collated a lot of testimonies that were kind of disseminated among other media outlets, and then spoke to Palestinian lawyers and Palestinian former detainees who were being, rounded up on the street in Gaza and sent to Israeli detention centres, without charge, without trial, and subjected to all kinds of abuse and torture. This, as you know, has become a much bigger story. Israeli human rights groups have also done a lot of excellent work on this, but Selam has covered this extensively. Palestinian human rights groups have been reporting on this from the very beginning as well. So I think we played a role in kind of, maximizing people's exposure to those testimonies. We published an article actually in the last 5 or 6 months that was revealing new data about the number of Palestinians who had died in Israeli custody since October 7th. The number that we know is around 100. I think at the time, which was about 6 months ago, it was 98 that we knew of since October 7th. That is equal to, I think, a third of the total number of Palestinians ever killed in Israeli custody, between 1948 and October 7th. And from October 7th until today, it's equal to a third of the total.
I think you also asked about how it's possible, despite the nature of Israel, and I think Israel has interest in appearing as a liberal democracy, and so most of Israeli media just fell in line on October 7th and even before, so the Israeli authorities never had to go after Israeli media, and I think we've simply flown under the radar in a lot of cases, but also Israel just doesn't see us as enough of a threat to actively go after us in a way that would expose that they are not, in fact, a liberal democracy. But that might change. We know a lot of laws in the Knesset they're trying to pass a lot of laws that would make the kind of work that we do impossible. And this is something that we discussed, that there might be a day when Plus 972 cannot exist within Israel. But so far, so.
I think this is also related to the question on the Hannibal Directive and belief of the Israeli public. And I want to say that the rejection of the narratives we present and the belief in the military complex is absolute. So it's actually not that hard to report these things. I think it's also related to the question of torture. So the data is there, the testimonies are there, people just don't want to listen. And when you talk to Israelis about the Hannibal complex, they just say directive, they just say, no, that's a lie. You're falling into foreign press narratives, you're falling into the kind of anti-militaristic things that you hear from the international radical left, which is now a concept in Israel. The kind of like the fear of the woke, whatever that means, is now equal to the fear of anything else. So I think that's the irony. That kind of goes back to what I said about the kind of very intentional joining in, what Alaa just said, of media bodies and of general public to the kind of mainstream militaristic narrative. Actually, it's not that hard to report on these things at this point. Again, like this might change, I join in what I'm saying, but at the moment, it is just really, people want to believe a certain narrative that they're given, and anything that contravenes that, they say, well, that's fake news. So I think, in a way, that's more depressing to me, because because I think it'd be easier to say, you know, the stakes are very high and people are afraid to go into prison if they report against the government, but actually that's not the case. I think living within Israeli society, militarism is so deep and is so all-encompassing that to be released from it, to be able to look at it and to say, actually, not only are you committing war crimes on a scale that hasn't been seen in recent decades, but actually also endangering your own people, is something that is just impossible to think about.
I'll also just add on Hannibal, we actually didn't need to reveal that Israel used the Hannibal Directive because actually other Israeli media outlets, mainstream Israeli media outlets, were the first to kind of reveal that with sources inside the military, and that didn't take that long after October 7th, right? I think the onus then was on the international media to pick up that story, and that just never happened. I'll say what we did reveal through other investigations was the ways that the Israeli military endangered hostages held in Gaza once they'd already been taken into Gaza over the subsequent weeks, months, years that they were held there, and we had one investigation. It was published, I think, in early 2025 around the Israeli military's deliberate use of toxic byproducts from its bombs. It discovered, actually before October 7th, that if it drops a bomb, a bunker buster bomb, these huge heavy bombs on tunnels in Gaza, that when it explodes, it releases carbon monoxide gas as a byproduct of the explosion, which in a trapped space like a tunnel can kill someone, 100 meters away, 200 meters away. And this was used deliberately to try to kind of maximize the chances of killing Hamas commanders underground. And in doing so, we know it killed Israeli hostages and certainly endangered many more.
So maybe the question of outreach, Alaa?
Yeah. Lavender is our biggest story yet. It's not in the tens of thousands. It's over 1 million readers and counting. Every month, it's on the top of the list of our readership. So it's over 1 million in the first year that we published it, and again, it's been re-reported on by many other outlets. So it's all over the world now.
Yeah, I'll just say as well, I think that's 1 million on 972. Immediately after we published Lavender on our website, The Guardian followed up with a report, basically just rehashing our reporting, which I think went exponentially further than ours did. That reached several millions of more people. I think at the time there was still a lot of skepticism to the validity of our reporting and the reliability and accuracy of what we were revealing. Which was then, I think, the Guardian added weight to our reporting, especially given that we're a small outlet that a lot of people around the world hadn't heard of at the time. What happened in the months after is that basically every major outlet in the world published a follow-up on the Israeli military's use of AI, most of them citing our reporting, some of them pretending that they'd revealed things like that for the first time. But I think this is how we see our role. We see our role as the kind of vanguard of this reporting, of this kind of information war that we've discussed here. If other outlets follow us, perfect. That's exactly what we want. But yeah, it's we do what we can at the front of that.
Okay, so to your question regarding our role as Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in Israel, it connects to what Dana said. There are no formal restrictions on our work, but there are ripple effects that we feel given the intimidation that also partner organizations of us have. So, for example, the law that's being discussed now in the Knesset to limit the political expression of organizations that receive funding from foreign state entities, so-called. This already creates an atmosphere of self-censorship and fear. Obviously, organizations we work with, activists, actors we work with on the ground have witnessed violence by right-wing thugs that come to events and try to kind of disturb the events. There were, in the years past, also not physical attempts, but kind of intimidating attempts at events that we were holding. But it's all on the level of let's say, not state intimidation yet, but just the effect of working in a very right-wing, very militaristic society on topics such as anti-militarism. and justice for Palestinians, for example. And I will also say there have been instances where we were restricted from working with Israeli organizations that are registered in Israel by the German Foreign Office, who didn't approve of these organizations' work because they said they ran counter to German-Israeli interests, or the interests of German-Israeli relationship. So these are basically, and this was reported on also in the media, in German media, Spiegel, for example. This was in early 2025. So the only, let's say, formal infringement we had on our work on the ground is basically from the German side until today, which is also somewhat ironic, I would say. So now we could open for another round of 2 to 3 questions, please.
I know it's not your sorry. I know it's not your focus, but I've seen some. You also did some critical article on the Iranian regime, and I was wondering how do you perceive the current debate on campism? Because I feel like, especially since the so-called 12-day war, within kind of like left-wing movement in solidarity with Palestinians, it's kind of like the misinformation of the Iranian regime becomes, kind of like excels, and I mean, they're doing a very good job, I have to say, but still, it's coming from kind of like an left-wing Iranian diaspora perspective, it's becoming very hard to be within kind of like Palestinian context, given like our own trauma, but still it's important to not put kind of like the freedom of the people in Iran in contrast to the freedom of the people in Palestine and Lebanon and the whole region in itself. So I was wondering what you think about it.
Thank you. 1 or 2 other questions? If not, we could answer this very important question, so thank you for this. Who would like to answer? Alaa, okay.
Yeah, we see what you're saying. Obviously, we have very clear values that we profess, and those values extend to everyone, including the Iranian people. There's no sort of official stance. We're a magazine. I can say what I think, and we also have Orly Noy, for example, who is Persian, Jewish Persian, and she's very critical of the Iranian regime, and I think I share her opinion that clearly this regime is criminal, and it clearly has hijacked Iran and is oppressing its people, and we know that the Iranian regime has killed tens of thousands of Iranians, and that part is definitely not complicated. Unfortunately, I don't think that the US or Israel are ever going to be working for the interest of the Iranian people, and there's a very real question of, okay, so a regime is killing its own people. What responsibility does the international community have? And what responsibility do we have as media outlets, but also as, you know, the pro-Palestine camp is, you know, it's not a monolith, it's not one, and in my opinion, the freedom of the Palestinians is not more important. It's exactly as important as the freedom of the Iranian people, as the freedom of the Syrian people. Unfortunately, not everyone shares that opinion, but that just means that they themselves are betraying their own values, which I refuse to do, and I know everyone in the magazine refuses to do as well. I hope I answered that.
Do you get backlash for that?
I'm sorry?
Do you get backlash from that? I mean, as a magazine?
We got backlash when Orly wrote about the regime. There's obviously voices that either in truth they think that it's not a criminal regime, and then there are the misinformed people. In my opinion, they're misinformed who think that it's this great regime that helps that stands for the freedom of the Palestinians and all of that, and we know that that's just not true. But yeah.
You want to add, Dana?
Just quickly from the Israeli inside perspective on our discourse, and again, I'm very grateful to have Oli Noy on the team, because also we translate a lot of stuff from Iranian dissenters in the diaspora, and oftentimes it goes translating into Hebrew and then into English for 972. I think not only what Alaa said, that there's no contradiction. I think the freedom of the Iranian people is bound with the freedom of Palestinian people, and it's getting away from Israel and America as kind of this new axis of evil. And I mean, those of us in the audience who are old enough to remember the Iraq War and Tony Blair and other war criminals saying that we are going to free the Iraqi people and women in headdresses, etc., it just really feels like the same discourse is reverberating and used to justify various other war crimes. So I think, again, it's our role to pick these narratives apart and to say we are absolutely committed to freedom and human rights of the Iranian people, but not through bombarding, the kind of through this imperialistic axis, which is sadly what the Israeli public has been getting. And it's kind of strange within Israeli media, the kind of, oh, look what the horrible things that the Iranian regime is doing, and then justifying the American attack. So I think it's our role to be critical of that, and then also to kind of keep speaking up for the freedom of Iranian people.
Okay, maybe one last question before we wrap up this evening, if there is. I don't see any. Or yes, there is one. Okay. Please.
Ja, thanks to you. Kurz auf Deutsch, keine Frage, sondern.
So just 1 second. Do you want to put on the headphones?
No problem. It's not so important. So.
Of course.
No. Okay, I can do it in English as well, but it's not a question. It's actually an invitation for an upcoming event on 18th of June, so in almost 2 weeks. It will take place in Bellevue de Monaco, and it will be a reading by Thomas Dotas-Dreyfus, and he will read from his book Kein Heimisch, Kindheit in Israel, Leben in Deutschland. And yes, you're very welcome to join. It's 7 p.m. free entrance.
Okay, for this last promotional word, I would like to, and of course, for an important event, Thomas' work is really important also for the German language discourse. I would like to call it an evening. It was a very, very inspiring, moving, but also I think very informative discussion for all of us. Thank you, of course, to Dana, to Ben, for being here with us. Thank you to all of you for coming and staying and asking questions. And of course, a big thanks again to Kerem from Medico, for the translators over here, for doing this amazing work. And last but not least, to my colleagues Tamar and Jan from the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, with whom, without this would have not been possible. So thank you so much, and have a nice evening.